Okay. And let's start sharing the presentation. All right. Communication and giving feedback. So I'm grateful to the coalition for offering these workshops. We're going to focus today on perception, projection, pausing. All right, next slide. So to begin with, I'd like you to consider your learning edges. Think about when it feels awkward or you have a hard time communicating, either sharing what it is you need, sharing a boundary. I mean, it could be something like a coworker saying, I really need to talk, and you're saying, I'm willing to listen. I cannot do so right now. Um, I'm happy to do so in a half hour or tomorrow, when you know that you're overwhelmed or you're in a place where you can't take more in. Do you need to give feedback and you find that that's difficult? I realize that it's easy for me to say something like, oh, good job, which is not terribly specific. And it's harder for me to say, let's reconsider how we do this. I appreciate what you're saying to me about how you want to go about this. I realize that I had a different way of thinking about it. Let me share and let's figure out how we do this. Which is struggling sometimes to present difficult information. And sometimes we have to present information that is, that really is not what is needed here. We really do have to do this differently. And when we are struggling, when we don't want to give difficult information, one of the things that happens is that we can actually be more harsh than we intend because we're trying to get it out. So think about your learning edges. What you would like to know about communication skills and giving feedback. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to think about that and write down a couple notes.
Did you want us to put these in the chat or just to think about them?
I want you to keep them for the time being. We're going to come back to them.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. So my experience is that the closer the relationship is to us, the more important the relationship is to us, the harder time we have when we experience the information we need to share as difficult. We can become more hesitant the greater the intimacy, which is such a flip because we also know that sharing difficult information, being vulnerable, is what deepens intimacy. So let's go to the next slide. And the next slide. All right. So let's start with listening. And I'm well aware that everyone on this call, or I'm guessing that everyone has heard the term active listening. You may have even had training in active listening, that we're listening with the intention to understand, as opposed to I'm listening because I'm waiting for you to take a breath and pause so I can say what I really want to say, right? Actually listening to understand. And in our work, we want people to listen even more deeply with empathy. It's not just about understanding the words that are said, it's about understanding the feeling tone, understanding when someone is struggling to get words out. And we have to suspend judgment. It's in our field, what we expect is that people will believe survivors, will believe people when they tell us a story. And I remember for 10 years, I worked with juvenile female offenders. And every girl, I mean, so the first 5 years, I worked with 70 girls each year. And I remember how the girls would often tell me things in a way, either A, they thought I wanted to hear them, or B, that would help them get their needs met. And the staff that I supervised would say, well, I just think she's lying. I don't think what she's saying is truthful. And I would say, let's suspend judgment. Let's hear what it is she has to say. And we can then go through the steps that are on the right side of the slide. We can ask open-ended questions. We can request clarification. We're attentive to what she says. We can summarize it back to her, what she says, paraphrase it. We can reflect the feelings that we think are coming from her, right? We have to be attuned to that and ask even deeper or more probing questions. And what and I did that not with an intention to, let's trip her up or let's get a different story, right? It was about, let's help her even better understand her story and what it is that she's really asking for or really needing. Now, it's kind of funny because I actively taught listening skills for about 10 years when I was on faculty at the University of Alaska in Juneau. And what I realized was that the hardest thing for me was to slow down. Slow down. I don't need all the information right this minute. It may very well be urgent and important. It's probably not a crisis right this minute. And if it is, then I'll speed up and I'll speed up what I need to do, but slow it down, which also helps the people we're listening to slow it down. So when we request clarification, right? I mean, we've heard the phrase, I think, with paraphrasing. Okay, what I heard you say is, and I have a really good friend who says things like, the story I'm making up about this is, and so whatever phrasing you use that helps, what I find helps is to summarize. And I'll say to people, I'm going to give to you what I understand so far. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And we will focus on perception. So perception is like a lens, right? We look at the world through what we think is clear eyes. I'm looking at the world and I'm using myself as the point of reference. So everyone thinks and sees exactly what I just saw and thought and heard. Okay, no. I have all kinds of lenses, right? I have the lens from having grown up in 10 years out of my first 18 in Europe. I have the lens of having worked in the field of sexual assault since I was 19. I have the lens of my family. I have the lens of the fact that my father was full-blooded German. My mother is Native American and Welsh. So there are so many lenses that we bring. And one of the things that perception checking allows us to do is to make sure that we share what we heard, what we got out of what was shared. and be able to say, is that accurate? Is it accurate? And to not be defensive when someone says back to us, no, it's not accurate. It's like, okay, great. Help me out with that. And you know that often working with survivors, whether you're working with the survivor or with staff, people will say to you, oh yeah, I'm fine. And you're looking at this staff person and they look like they're folding in on themselves. You know, their body language suggests that in fact they're not fine. And I will just ask, you know, I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm wondering. I said to my adult son the other day, how are you feeling? And he looked at me and he said, really? And I said, yeah, really, how are you feeling? Right? It's so easy to sort of walk by someone, how are you feeling? Fine, have a great day, as opposed to, I'd like to know what's going on. And this is my perception of what's going on. And I want to make sure I'm accurate before we continue. The next slide, please. Projection. So the definition there says that psychological projection is the process of misinterpreting what's inside of us, our thinking, our feeling, as coming from outside, right? People, again, those girls, the teenage girls, but they say things to me like, you're making me want to go off. I'm just going to go off. You're making that happen. Or I was having a really good day until I saw her. You're like, okay, wait a minute. And it's a defense mechanism. It's a way that we don't have to own our own thinking and feeling. We don't own our own experience. We make it about someone else. And that's what happens when people do victim or survivor blaming, right? They don't want to have to deal with the fact that the amount of sexual assault, the kinds of sexual assault, the many kinds of violence and gender-based violence that we have in our culture exists. So instead, it's just easier to say, if so-and-so was dressed differently, if so-and-so would act differently, what was she doing there? Well, she lives there. Okay. So that kind of blaming, bullying, and microaggressions. So it's interesting to me, I will see bullying sometimes even among leaders who aren't owning their own shadows, right? We all have strengths, we all have light, and we have shadows. And when we don't own those, we're again projecting them onto other people. And we believe that gives us cause to then be hurtful to them, which is true for bullying and microaggressions. If we could come back as a whole group, please. So I'm wondering if there are questions or comments about what you've seen so far, just top of mind.
I love that visual of light versus shadows instead of good or bad or positive and negative. I like how you put that.
So Meredith, Parker Palmer has a very interesting article about leadership. It's called Leading from Within. And one of the things that Parker talks about is that leaders in particular, I mean, it can be true for anyone who's prominent or powerful in a system or in a relationship, can cast a long shadow. And we really need to own our own strengths and shadows so we're not projecting them.
Great. I'll look that up. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Alexandra, can we go into small groups? What I would like people to do is to share what they wrote earlier about their communication learning edges, and anything that has come up so far for them, and then to bring one piece back for the whole group. So Alexandra will put you into small groups. When it pops up, please just accept it to go into a breakout room. 10 minutes, everybody, 10 minutes. So reflective practice is about taking the time and having the ability to reflect on what it is we're doing, which we're doing right now. Next slide. And what it does is it helps us stay engaged as learners. So reflection includes looking at our thoughts, identifying biases, looking at our perceptions of situations. The broccoli example is perfect. Example of what does it mean when people bring us sort of what we want, but not what we want. And what is our perception of the situation? So the objective for us as individuals and as organizations is to engage in individual and collective reflective practices. And let me introduce you to some. Next slide. So the first one is to pause. The broccoli example created here on this training. You know what? That will get referred to way too many times.
Yay.
So the first one is to pause, right? Whether we're trying to communicate something that we feel awkward about, whether we're trying to interpret what someone has said. So my mom is fairly traditional and traditional native. And so here's an example that isn't about ceremony. It's just about everyday things. So she will say, would you like to do the dishes? Or would you like to clean your room? Right? She did that all the time when we were growing up. And of course, the answer was from teenagers, no. And she would say, I am being polite. And we would say, Mom, just say, it's time to do the dishes. Now is the time to clean your room. My mother is 91 years old. She still will say, would you like to do the dishes? So I pause. I don't have to correct her. I can figure out what it is she's saying. I have the high context of growing up in that family. But with our clients, we don't often have that high context. And we may think we have high context with one another on staff, but we don't necessarily, especially given the pandemic, when we haven't been able to be together all that often. So we haven't been able to share a lot of stories. I can't tell you how many staff teams I've been working with that will say to me, we don't know one another. So that is a low context communication process. Yeah, Brittany says, I forgot to introduce myself when I talk to people now. Well, there you go. You know, it's like we have to share more. All right, so I'd like you to do a piece of writing, and this is how it works. So one of the reflective practices is to write. And we can write about our triggers. We can journal. And sometimes we journal by answering a question. Sometimes we journal by sharing something out of our day. Sometimes you make a poem or haiku. right? Writing about triggers is a useful exercise, especially if you're going to share it with one another in staff. So, for example, one of our staff members, one of her triggers actually was around working with teenagers who were really sarcastic. She called them snotty. Okay. I said, okay, let's back away from loaded language that puts all kinds of meaning that may not be held actually in how she's coming across, right? You're calling it snotty. I might call it defensive. I might call it protective. How about if I don't call it anything? I'll just tell you what it is she said and how she appeared. And I'll ask her, what is she feeling? But it's really helpful to know your triggers. I know one of my triggers is around esteem around work. And so when someone says to me, you know, what you're doing just isn't that important, it's like, I can feel it. I can feel myself shutting down. All right. So I'd like you to pause. I don't need you to do a lot of writing. Just if there's something you know that your stomach clenches, your jaw clenches, you start to get a headache when you're in a conversation or someone's talking about something. Racist jokes is one of my triggers. Not funny. So just if you would just make some comments on your paper about triggers for you. Dyads for appreciative storytelling is another reflective practice. It's a way to be able to ground our appreciation for what has happened to us and what's happened to others. So one of the things we know from the brain research is that our brains tend to build grooves with things that happen over and over, and we can constantly build new grooves. And one of the things that we know about that as well is that our brains tend to latch on to negative things easier than they do to the positive. So appreciative storytelling is an exercise that you can do with your staff, you can do with someone you care about, you can do with a stranger on the street. And it works like this. It comes out of appreciative inquiry, which was developed at Case Western by people like David Cooper Ryder, Diana Whitney, several other folks. And it just keeps growing as we understand the power of appreciation. So when I've been in a room of 100 people where we did this exercise, got people into dyads, and we said to them, would one of you please share a story? And you're going to share a story and make it anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. So you're going to share a story about something that was wonderful. It made your day. It's a high point of your month. It's an amazing thing that you appreciate. And you're going to share that with one other person. And the other person's job is to help you tell the story. So they're listening very appreciatively. If you pause, they'll ask you a question to help you go deeper into the story. You know, what was that made that so amazing? Does it remind you of another time that was amazing? Right? When we're the listener, what we're not trying to do is one up somebody. Oh, well, that story, let me tell you about my story. We're trying to help people really anchor the experience. Imagine actually dropping an anchor from a ship into the water and it goes all the way down into the sand, into the ground. We're anchoring the positive. Then you switch and the other person tells a story for 10 minutes to 30 minutes. As the facilitator, you decide how long these stories are lasting. And again, the listener's job is to help anchor the story, anchor it deep. Visualization is a really amazing way to help people with mindfulness, with relaxation, and with motivation. I listed there 2 apps that are free that have visualizations and have relaxations. Insight Timer is one, Balance is another. We'll close our workshop today with a visualization. But at this time, what I'd like you to do is to take a deep breath in and release it. There's a kind of breathing that's called box breathing. And with box breathing, you breathe in deep to the count of 4, you hold for 4, you breathe out to the count of 4, and you hold for 4. So we're going to do a box breathing. So breathe normally. And on your next inhalation, now breathe out very deeply and breathe deeply in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. And breathe normally. Box breathing has the gift of both giving your body oxygen and bringing you right back to yourself. It's a really good exercise if you find yourself in a situation where suddenly everything is feeling speeded up or everything is feeling chaotic. Do box breathing 1, 2, 3 times and bring yourself back to center. And it allows your mind to actually get more clear. Okay, let's come back to the whole group. And let me just ask if there are questions or comments about that section. We're going to move into talking about giving feedback, and we'll incorporate the communication skills we talked about. We'll incorporate the reflective practice, especially pausing, and we'll talk some about giving feedback. But before I move on, I'm just pausing. Okay, next slide, Alexandra. And next slide. There are many types of feedback. Here are 4. Informal feedback is when we tell each other either, it could be an email, but often informal feedback is verbal. It's often not written in any form, where we say, I really appreciated the work. Thanks for letting us know. Thanks for the conversation. Okay. So we give each other informal feedback, actually almost all the time. We're giving each other informal feedback when we're smiling at each other when something is done, or when we say thank you. Oh, and my puppy's giving me informal feedback at the moment. Formal feedback is when we give people feedback in writing. And we can do that in email, we could do that in a memo, we could do that, I'll describe the next two. But formal feedback, once you put something in writing and you start the documentation process, formal feedback then is something that is often kept and referred to. So formative feedback is usually in writing, and formative feedback says it's developmental. It says, okay, you know what? This is the next step. You've accomplished these steps. You're where I would expect you to be given this amount of time and what we've been doing. Summative feedback is like an evaluation at the end of a course or at the end of a workshop, when you say, yes, these were the objectives, these were my expectations, this is what got met, this is how they were met. Next slide. The next slide is simply what I just said to you. I just wanted you to have it as part of your notes. Next slide. Most of the time in our organizations, we're going to be giving feedback that really is about reflection for action. And it's really even more effective when we pay attention to it being learner-centered. So we might say, what do you think went well, when we're sitting with someone and giving informal feedback that would then become formal if we put the answers and the questions in writing afterwards or at the time. What do you think could be done differently? I mean, that's a question that we often ask in a staff meeting. What, we often will say it all together. Okay, this is what happened with this survivor, or this is what has happened with this grant. What do you think went well? What could be done differently? What could be further improved? How can what we're trying to do be achieved? Well, those are also really good questions to ask one-on-one, because people feel acknowledged, and feedback can be a gift when it helps people to feel acknowledged. If you would stop sharing, I'd like people to go into small groups for, let's see, for 10 minutes again, because I would like them to have a chance to talk about reflective practice. I'd like each group to have an example of when reflective practice would be effective for you, when you might use it, almost like an action plan. This is where I'm going to use it. This is the kind I'm going to use. I'm going to pause. I'm going to start doing some writing. I want my staff team to share about triggers, or I want my staff team to share about, do appreciative storytelling. And I'd like people to have an opportunity to talk about feedback and what kinds of feedback are being used in your setting now. That's the question. What are you using now? So, Alexandra, if we could again go into groups for 10 minutes. These steps give you an idea about how to give feedback, especially when you want to give feedback that you want to document, formal feedback, for example. And when I have feedback for someone, I will try to find a time that works for them. So I don't want to surprise somebody with a feedback session, even if it's all good. I want people to be able to be ready, be able to be open to hear it. And certainly if it's like an annual evaluation, I'll share whatever form I'm going to use. You know, sometimes if we're working for a state agency, or a federal agency, it's a pretty specific form. Universities are a little more lenient, but anyway, there's generally areas, right, in our work that we evaluate. And so I want the other person to know what those areas are. I don't want them to be surprised. And anything that I give in a written feedback, at some point, I should have also given to them in a verbal feedback session. I wouldn't want someone to come for a 6-month or annual review and say, "You never talked to me about this." You know, really, that's my failure then as a supervisor, right? So for me as well, and you have to know your own org culture and your own style. But for me, feedback is always about people learning. Even if it's an annual eval that's going to be put in someone's personnel file, I want to talk in there somewhere about how people have progressed, what they've learned. And I want to be really specific and be aware of my nonverbal cues. And then afterwards, reflect on how I did. How did that feedback session go? And of course, it's easier to give feedback when it's going to be quote unquote all good. It's more difficult when there are hard things to share. I remember having to give feedback when someone was really harsh in how they spoke to some members of the staff. Not everyone, but it was really clear that this person had people that she liked and people that evidently she didn't. And, I gave her that feedback all the way along. This is what I heard. And I had to say, this will stop. This will stop. So what can I do to make this different? What needs to happen here? And it was tough. I mean, she cried. She said, those people don't deserve for me to have to take my time. Well, you know what? Let's talk about behavior. Okay, so I'm going to leave the feedback slide up and I'm going to do a quick visualization. So I'll just ask you to get comfortable. You can have your eyes open or closed. We're going to start with box breathing. So do an exhalation and breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Now very gently raise your shoulders up as high as you can raise them, and gently let them fall. Let your eyes soften and relax the muscles in your face. And again, raise one shoulder now up to your ear and let it fall. Raise the other shoulder up and let it fall. And imagine that you're standing under warm light. Could be sunshine radiating down, warm light radiating over your body. From the top of your head, all the way down your spine. down across your torso, all the way down your legs into the ground. And this light reflects your spirit. How amazing your work has been as you have talked with other people, that you have listened, that you have learned. The light brings you clarity. And when there are times when you find yourself confused or kind of at a loss for words, pause, do a box breathing, and imagine the light all around you. Now breathe in and hold and breathe out. Wiggle your fingers and toes. Please stop sharing the slides, Alexandra. Thank you, everybody. Thank yourselves for being here today. You can open your eyes if they're closed. I appreciated getting to have time with you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much, Dr. Horman. I hope everybody has a great afternoon. I will be sending out the link to the evaluation for this training shortly after we hop off the call. Once you fill that out, you'll get your certificate sent to you. And I look forward to talking to you all later. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.